Test? Yes. Excellent. Hi, everyone. So I'm very happy today to be introducing Pax Ahimsa Gethen. Did I say that right? Who is user FunCrunch on Wikipedia and is a queer, black, trans, vegan activist, blogger, and photographer. Pax has been very active on the various projects, especially dealing with issues of trans representation, and has also been particularly active recently working on various areas on the projects, including LGBT studies and the Women in Red Wiki projects, and also gave a talk at Wiki Conference North America on these topics last year. So with that, I will hand it over to Pax.
Thank you very much. So I am Pax, and if I could ask for people to please hold your questions, if you have any, to the end. I've left plenty of time for Q&A at the end of this presentation. So my presentation is Living Persons, Trans Lives and Wikipedia, Representation and Impact. So as a transgender person myself, I am going from the premise that transgender and non-binary lives are legitimate. Our identities are not up for debate. And the well-being of trans people is affected by our representation on Wikipedia. This applies to Wikipedia editors as well as readers, and it applies to discussion that happens on article talk pages and policy pages as well as on the article itself. Some of this representation is positive and some is negative, and not all of the harm that is caused by a negative representation is due to malice, however. Some of it is simply due to ignorance. So to address the ignorance that does exist about transgender and non-binary people, I'd like to start with some basic terminology. This will be review to some of you. So the terms gender and sex are often used interchangeably. Many people think that basically if you're male and a man, you have one set of body parts. If you're female and a woman, you have another set of body parts, and that's all there is to it. But what really matters, especially when it comes to trans people, for treating people with respect, is our gender identity. This is what trans author Julia Serrano has referred to as the subconscious sex, your internal sense of who you are, which is not dependent on any surgeries or legal avenues you might have gone to transition. Gender identity can be expressed through a variety of ways, through clothing, mannerisms, even language. These are different ways people can express their gender identity, but gender identity and expression are separate, and they are also separate from sexual orientation. Sexual orientation means who you are attracted to. So these three things, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, are all separate. Some basics about gender identity. A transgender person is a person who does not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. We like to use the word sex assignment rather than biologically or anatomically or genetically male or female, because this shows that we are honoring the person's own identity instead of one that was given to them without their consent. A cisgender person, on the other hand, does identify with that sex, male or female, that they were assigned at birth. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the term cisgender. It's not, cis is not an acronym, it's not a slur. Cisgender, cis, the prefix is as opposed to trans. Cis is Latin for on the same side of, as opposed to trans on the other side of. So that's all it means. It's just a way of describing people who do identify with that sex assignment without casting certain people as normal and others as abnormal. Now, a non-binary person identifies as something other than male or man, female or woman. Non-binary people may be agender, like myself, not having a gender. They might be bigender, pangender. There are a number of different gender identities. Some non-binary people describe themselves as genderqueer, These terms are often used interchangeably, including on Wikipedia, but non-binary, I feel, is a better umbrella term because not all people who do not identify with the gender binary prefer to use the term genderqueer. Now, intersex people, this is not a gender identity, but intersex people face many of the same challenges as non-binary and trans people, and some of them do identify as trans or non-binary themselves. But what an intersex person is a person who has physical sex characteristics that vary from typical binary expectations. But an intersex person could be any of these identities: transgender, cisgender, non-binary, or genderqueer. Now, when it comes to addressing trans people with respect, it's important to be aware of our pronouns. You'll often hear people talk about preferred pronouns, but unless someone specifically says that they prefer one set of pronouns or the other, assume that those pronouns are mandatory. Singular they is gaining a lot of popularity for non-binary people. Not all non-binary and genderqueer people use singular they, but it is available. It's accepted in a number of style guides now. It's accepted on a number of social media sites as a personal pronoun. So that is my pronoun as well. Salutations like Mr. and Ms., Sir and Ma'am are a little trickier, especially in the US. We don't really have any widely recognized non-binary salutations of that sort right now, but in the UK, mix or mux, MX, is gaining popularity, and it's actually accepted on some official forms in the UK now, so I'm hoping that will come to the US as well. And the thing to do if you misgender someone, just apologize and move on. Don't, make a huge deal of it. Don't say, oh, I'm the last person who would ever do that. I'm so sorry, because that just draws more attention to the person's gender, which is not what you want to do. So it's best to just apologize and move on. I have some examples here of trans people. These are all photos that are available on Commons. Laverne Cox is an actress. You might be familiar with her from Orange is the New Black, and she's also on the TV show Doubt. She is a trans woman, so that means that she is a woman who was assigned male at birth. Ryan Casada is a musician and activist. He is a trans man, so he's a man that was assigned female at birth. Then we have Jamie Shoup, who is a non-binary person, notable for being the first person who was legally declared non-binary in the US. And then Pigeon Pagonis, who is an activist, is intersex and also identifies as non-binary. All of these people except Jamie have articles on Wikipedia, and Jamie is referenced in a number of Wikipedia articles because of the precedent that was set with the non-binary declaration. And I want to talk a little bit about myself, so you know where I'm coming from. I was born in 1970. I was assigned female. Again, all that means is basically someone looked between my legs and said it's a girl, and made the assumption that I would grow up into a woman, which turned out to be correct for a time. I was raised as a girl and lived as a woman. I came out as bisexual in 1991. I was pretty active locally in the bisexual community here. But eventually I came to realize that it was not just my sexuality, but my gender identity that was queer. And so in the year 2013, I eventually did change my name and pronouns. I think part of what took it so long for me to realize my identity, because you hear a lot of trans kids might know as soon as age 5, sometimes even younger, that they're transgender. But, I grew up in West Virginia in the 70s. I didn't have any role models, certainly no non-binary role models, and not even trans men. I didn't know that these identities existed. I didn't know it was an option. It wasn't until much later that I was exposed to a wider diversity of trans people that I could really understand who I was. So I did change my name. I have a kind of unusual name, so I could explain it as Pax is Latin for peace. Ahimsa is Sanskrit for do no harm or nonviolence. And Gethen is from a book by my favorite author, Ursula Le Guin, called The Left Hand of Darkness, which features the planet Gethen, which has all physically androgynous people who have no gender roles at all, which I think would be awesome. So I changed my whole name, not just my first, like most trans folks do. And then I made it legal in 2014. So I am now legally male, but I really do identify as agender, not having a gender. I feel that my subconscious sex, as I described earlier, is male. So I describe myself as a transsexual male. But it's important to realize that most trans people do not use the term transsexual anymore. Transgender is a broader term, so that should always be used unless you're sure that someone identifies with the term transsexual. And I also identify as queer rather than bisexual because I just feel that's a better description of my sexual orientation. So a little bit about my experience on Wikipedia. I made my first edit back in 2008, but I didn't really become highly active until just the last couple of years. I have a particular focus on gender-related pages, pages related to transgender issues. I've also uploaded hundreds of photos to Wikimedia Commons, a lot of photos of, again, transgender-related events, a lot of photos of rallies and protests and so forth. Now, I do have my full name and photo and a link to my website on my English Wikipedia user page, and that unfortunately has led to some harassment. Last year, I was stalked by an anonymous editor. They hacked, well, not hacked because they were open to editing, but edited my pages on English Wikipedia and Commons and Meta, dead naming, basically putting my birth assigned name that I don't use anymore that really bothers me when I see it on there, calling me she and a female, and it just escalated. Even once I got those pages protected, they basically stalked all of my edits, and it was very damaging, and I eventually had to get the support and safety committee involved, and through some help with some helpful administrators, eventually those attacks stopped. Unfortunately, it didn't end there, and they started chasing me all over the internet, on Reddit, on another wiki that I edited, and on my blog, until I finally turned off comments there. This didn't stop me from contributing to Wikipedia, fortunately. In fact, in a direct response to this, I proposed in the last year's Inspire campaign against harassment an initiative to prevent user pages from being edited by anonymous and new users. So with the help of Chris Schilling from the foundation, I started an RFC for this after the campaign, and it did gain consensus. And so we ended up, instead of making user pages semi-protected by default, we ended up implementing this with an edit filter. So the attempt to edit the user page is captured, but the edit is not actually made, which is actually useful for gathering some statistics about how many of these attempted edits are made. And people can now opt out of this with an unprotected user page template. So if they really do want their user page to be open to everybody, that is still an option. And I also just got even more active editing pages on transgender people, especially biographies. So, this didn't stop me, but that doesn't mean it didn't bother me. The impact of this harassment is still with me. And there are some people that really would not recover from this and just basically leave the project and never return. So I'm going to show you some potentially triggering language next, some examples of vandalism on gender-related pages, just to see what people are faced with when they come to this project. So these are just some examples that I've gathered just for this year. The page sex and gender distinction, basically people have been editing it to say man and woman, that's it, nothing else to it. They are the same thing, although as I've shown you, they are not. People are very invested in the idea that there are only two genders and they correspond with two sexes, and there's been a lot of vandalism of that type. For the pangender page, people say it's completely stupid and retarded. And basically, if you think otherwise, that there are otherwise than two genders, you're mentally incapable and a disgrace to the human race. And one of the most disturbing ones, last but not least, all of them should kill themselves because they are not human. That's the kind of edit that I would think would be basically retracted and not even available in the page history, but it's still there as of now. And it's kind of interesting that this page was made on the gender binary page, which was not even specifically a page about transgender people, but they felt the need to make that statement there. So it's not, just people that are looking at less visited pages that are exposed to this. For example, the gender page, which is considered a level 3 vital article on Wikipedia, so that's a very high ranking page, was vandalized with this "there are only two genders" crowd last year. And it's strange because it didn't get cached. When you went to the cache of the page, it showed the correct page. But when you did a search in Google for a period of time, what came back was the hack that said there are only two genders. And even though this was corrected several times, this just kept coming back. So I've been monitoring this in some other pages to see if this kind of thing is happening again, where basically the text summary snippet that shows up in Google says something other than the cache, because I don't know how that managed to get hacked that way. But my point is basically that Wikipedia is a very high ranking site, as we all know, on the internet. So what people are searching on Google comes up with these vandalized pages that can give people a very negative or incorrect impression about gender identity. So, of course, most of this vandalism is coming from anonymous and new users. So one remedy is to protect the page. Unfortunately, some of the people who still want to have their say just go on to make their statements on the talk pages. I have some examples here from the genderqueer page, which eventually I got argued to have semi-protected. So people posted on the talk page instead, "May Lord protect us from all this kind of depravity, and none of this shit exists." The cisgender page, another page that has been indefinitely semi-protected, in this case since January. Someone wrote, "This is an article is a violation of everything we know about biology to appease people who believe in make-believe." Whereas the article about people believing they are attack helicopters, that's a big meme, trying to associate transgender identity with attack helicopters. I've seen that vandalism in a number of places. And again, for the pangender article, it says there's only two genders. Only primitive, superstitious people believe otherwise, or people with severe mental disorders. So basically, some of this is blatant and obvious vandalism, but some of it is more subtle. And I'll have some more examples from the biography pages of trans people. For example, Chelsea Manning, most of you probably know, is a trans woman, soldier imprisoned for leaking documents from the US Army. Her sentence was commuted by Obama, and she was just released in May. And a lot of people really don't like that she is referred to as a woman on the page and would prefer to use male pronouns and her previous name. So they're saying things like enabling a mentally disordered person in his clinical delusion is not objective, rational, or credible. Comparing identifying as female to identifying as a German Shepherd. Saying that Chelsea is delusional, and saying that we should disregard anything that Wikipedia says otherwise about gender identity because it's all written by people with a far left extremist bias or gender identities disorder. Some more examples from a non-binary person, in this case, Asia Kate Dillon is a non-binary actor, uses singular they pronouns, and people really don't like, in some cases, using the singular they pronouns and have continually made their case on the page. Saying that this person is biologically defined as a woman, so should be referred to as a she, and this is a desecration of the English language. So, in response to continual disruption of this type on non-binary pages specifically, I eventually decided to create a template, MOS, which stands for Manual of Style, NB, which mirrors the existing templates, MOS-TW for trans women and MOS-TM for trans men. This doesn't actually prevent this kind of disruption in editing. In fact, I just reverted for about the 10th time an edit of another non-binary person's page that changed the singular they pronouns that they prefer to she. But at least this way people can't say they weren't informed. So this talk page template is available. I've put it on a number of talk pages for non-binary folks. The language in it isn't perfect because right now it mirrors the language in the templates for trans men and women, which is not entirely perfect, but I didn't feel like I wanted to change it without having consensus from some other editors. Basically, it goes from the Manual of Style. The Manual of Style says that the guideline for gender identity is to give precedence to self-designation as reported in the most up-to-date reliable sources, even when it doesn't match what's most common in reliable sources. So that part is good. But then it says when talking about trans people in other articles that are not the main biographical article, it says use context to determine which name or names to provide on a case-by-case basis. So that's where that part came in the template for non-binary people, trans men and women. But I feel like that language needs to be edited to make it clear that that's talking about referring to the person in other articles, not in their main biographical article. So that's an improvement that I'm hoping to get the consensus to make. Now, another problematic thing, from my opinion, in the Manual of Style is it says, in the case of transgender and non-binary people, birth names should be included in the lead sentence only when the person was notable prior to coming out. So that's good as far as it goes, but as far as I'm concerned, the birth name, or what we call dead name, should not be in there at all if the person transitioned prior to becoming notable. There's no reason to put that in the article. It's not about giving special treatment to trans people, and it's not historical revisionism. It's just treating the people with respect. I don't feel that the curiosity of the encyclopedia readers is enough justification to put that dead name, which can cause real harm, into the article if nobody knew about this person and they didn't become notable before they transitioned to using a new name. So a couple more recent initiatives we had, an RFC, a request for comment, to put gender neutral style into our policy guidelines and help pages. This wasn't specifically an initiative to help transgender people. It was just the idea that we don't need to use specific pronouns when not necessary. And again, this is just for guideline, policy, and help pages. This was not saying that editors could not use gendered pronouns or other gendered language on talk pages or elsewhere in the encyclopedia. So there was a very lengthy, heated debate on this, and not surprisingly, it did not pass, but or did not gain consensus for implementation. But what really bothered me more than the fact that it did not gain consensus was reading some of the comments on the page. For example, I do not support altering our text to the proposed double-think new language at the behest of a small minority of nonconformers who perceive microaggressions from standard wording. The day I am required to use the repulsive singular they will be the day I exit stage left from this project. We already focus too much energy into political correctness and newspeak. We are here to build an encyclopedia, not promote some new world order version of language. So I was very interested in the outcome of this RFC, but I just had to stop following it after a while because it was really bothering me that people were referring to, my pronouns as repulsive and gender neutral language as some kind of new world order. And then someone happened to say Wikipedia is already a welcoming environment for all genders, including non-binary or gender fluids. And I would have to say this was, kind of odd phrasing there, and probably not coming from someone who has actually lived the life of a non-binary person. So I would have to disagree with that. There was another RFC recently to alter the Manual of Style when referring to genderqueer people. And basically, this person said that since some people are uncomfortable with the singular they, but they don't want to misgender people either, why don't we just not use any pronouns and enforce using no pronouns for genderqueer people whatsoever? Fortunately, this failed overwhelmingly because I thought this was a bit ridiculous, and fortunately, people agreed with me on that, perhaps for different reasons than I would, but it's just another example of how people are thinking about gender and gender identity on Wikipedia. So, as I was saying, some comments on talk pages and such are more blatantly trans antagonistic than others. There's some things that are just more subtle that kind of get by that still really bother me as a trans person. For example, we're having a discussion on one talk page where one editor really doesn't think that Wikipedia should be referring to trans women as women because he doesn't consider that to be a settled issue. And when people pushed back on this, he said, do I really need to provide evidence that there are enormous numbers of people, organizations, politicians, ideologies, etc., that do not accept that transgender women are women? And it seems to me, based on how most people on the street would define the word woman, it would be more defensible for the article to say they were not not women, and also refer to the fact that this is a recent thing, which I disagree with, because transgender people have been around since the beginning of civilization. But well, you can see my opinion there from that photo I took in the Pride Parade on Sunday. I think that trans women certainly are women, but it just bothers me that this is up for debate at all. What editors like this are saying is that we need to have a neutral point of view because that's Wikipedia policy. But what I'm saying is that a neutral point of view, at least on the English Wikipedia, especially when it comes to the USA, is the viewpoint of a straight cisgender white male. That's all there is to it. And as far as charges that I'm an activist, yes, guilty, but I'm an activist for survival. That's what it takes as an openly transgender person to survive. And it's not a matter of political correctness to refer to our genders the way that we want them to be. It's a matter of treating people with respect. And it's not righting great wrongs, which is another Wikipedia policy of something not to do. It's just basically treating people with respect and understanding what it means to be a transgender or non-binary person. The fact is that there is a lot of harm done to trans people, and our population is marginalized and vulnerable. There was a study that said 41% of transgender and gender non-conforming adults have attempted suicide. 54% of trans youth, that's over half, have considered suicide, and a third of them have attempted it. And last year, there were 27 known murders, just ones that we know about, of trans people. And this year, there have been 13. And almost overwhelmingly, these are women of color. We actually have an event every year in November, the Transgender Day of Remembrance, to commemorate the people who have been lost to violence. This is a photo I took at the Day of Remembrance 2 years ago of CC McDonald, a trans woman who is fortunately still living, but she was jailed in a men's prison for defending herself against a violent attack. But it's not all about mourning the dead. We should be celebrating the living as well. That's why I named my talk here Living Persons. Partly that was a reference to our biographies of living persons policy, but also a reference to the fact that transgender people are alive and should be celebrated. We have an International Transgender Day of Visibility. It's held every year on March 31st, and I have some photos from that. Here's Tita Aida, a photo that I took of a trans woman at last year's celebration. She's an activist advocate for people with HIV and AIDS. We have Gigi Gorgeous. I took this photo at this year's Transgender Day of Visibility. YouTube celebrity who I just found out this morning was listed by Time Magazine as one of the 25 most influential people on the internet. That just got published yesterday, so I had to alter my slideshow real quick to throw that photo in. And Brianna Sinclair, a trans woman who is an opera singer, and she was the first transgender person to sing at a major league sporting event. She did that at an Oakland A's baseball game. We also have the Trans March, just happened on Friday, and I went as I've done for the last 4 years. It's in a number of cities, not just San Francisco, but it's been held here in San Francisco since 2004. In this photo from last year's Trans March, I've got Janetta Johnson. She works at the TGI Justice Project, which helps transgender people who are in prison or at risk of imprisonment. And she is surrounded by people from Ella para Trans Latinas, which is an organization to help transgender Latinas specifically. And I've got a few photos from this year's Trans March. Susan Stryker, she's a professor and author of books on gender theory. She had a Wikipedia article, but no photo. A photo had been requested a year ago, so I got that photo in there just a couple days ago. Alex Yuen, local activist and drag king, was the one of the community grand marshals for our Pride Parade on Sunday, and was also at the Trans March on Friday. And Mia Byrne, a musician who's performed in a number of venues throughout the country, she was also a performer at the Trans March. And of course, as some of you are probably familiar with, we've got our annual Wiki Loves Pride initiative. So I've been trying to contribute a bunch of articles to that. So far, I've still got a couple days left in the month, so I might add a few more. But so far, I've created 3 biographies of transgender people who weren't on the encyclopedia previously. Nevo Zieson is a non-binary Australian writer and activist. Chase Strangio is a lawyer with the American Civil Liberties Union. He was the lead attorney on Chelsea Manning's case, so I definitely think he should be notable enough for an article. And Megan Rohrer, a first openly transgender minister to be ordained by the Lutheran Church. And Megan also uses singular they, non-binary pronouns. And this photo is of from a rally we had to memorialize the victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting, which happened a year ago in Orlando. We actually had a 1-year memorial in the Castro for that. So there's some more good news for non-binary folks. We are starting to gain legal recognition. I mentioned Jamie Shoup was the first non-binary person in the U.S. to gain this recognition. That happened a year ago in June. And a couple months later, then intersex California resident Sarah Kelly Keenan also got legal non-binary status. And then this month, Oregon and Washington, D.C. started to allow an X marker on driver's licenses and state IDs for non-binary folks with no doctor's note or any kind of medical certification required. And there are bills pending in California and New York to do the same. Because even though Jamie and Sarah got declared as non-binary, they still don't have their driver's licenses stating that. So this is the next step. So hopefully this will snowball and just be available in more and more states after this. So there's some things that I suggest to raise awareness of non-binary folks if you're having gatherings like this or events. I would suggest avoiding dividing up into men's versus women's groups if you're having activities, not only because that leaves out people who are neither men or women, but because it also probably makes some very untrue assumptions about what it means to be a man or a woman. If you're greeting a group, I would try saying something gender neutral like hello everyone instead of ladies and gentlemen. You could also, if you want to be more formal, say honored guests or distinguished guests. Or if you want to be less formal, you could say just friends, folks, or comrades, although that has some implications that people don't really like. I hope, I kind of like the word, but I can understand some people might want to avoid it. Now, this is the big one, you guys. Now, guys is seen as gender neutral by just about everybody, but think about it, why is that? If guy were a gender neutral term, then gal should be as well. And how many of you have gone up to a mixed gender group of people and said, hey, gals? You know, you could get slapped in the face for that in certain places. So I don't think that guys is any more gender neutral than gals, but I screw up on this all the time. So, you know, no huge harm done, but just something to think about. Maybe say you all instead of you guys. And if you're referring to someone's partner and you don't necessarily know their gender, or you're just referring to partners in the abstract, you could use the term partner or spouse if the couple is actually married instead of saying husband or wife or girl or boyfriend, because that again is more gender inclusive. Now, if you're taking a survey on gender, which can be very helpful for assessing, you know, gender imbalances, which as we know, there's a huge gender gap on Wikipedia, so we do want to know the genders of people who are editing and using it. But think about, for your survey, why you are asking for this, and don't assume that everybody is either a man or a woman. Don't assume that gender is binary. And if you want to survey for transgender people, keep in mind that transgender is not itself a gender. Very few trans people identify simply as trans. They'll identify as a trans man or a trans woman or genderqueer or agender or some other description. So I wouldn't put 3 checkboxes that say male, female, and transgender because that's not really accurate. The best thing to do is just have all this stuff fill in the blank. That's the best case scenario. It's not always possible, but if you can put, you know, pronouns, gender, you know, what do you prefer to be called rather than assuming a finite list, that's the best way to go about it. And if you do want a survey to see how many transgender people are using this whatever project you're surveying for, then you could list that separately as an optional question. I have a couple of good examples from the Wikimedia Foundation. For last year's Wiki Conference North America, it says, with what gender do you identify? Female, male, other, prefer not to say. This is exactly what I recommend when you can't do fill in the blank because your software won't allow it or otherwise you don't have access to hack it. This is, I think, the best you can do in that regard. And then for the Inspire campaign that I mentioned, they did have a fill in the blank option in addition to female, male, or rather not say. So this is definitely improvement because when I got the annual fundraising survey in 2014, after I made my little annual donation to Wikipedia, it only had male and female options on that survey. So I actually wrote in and said, hey, wait a minute, could you maybe open this up a little bit the next year? They did add another option. So very good. So another thing to keep in mind if you want to be inclusive of more gender identities is privacy and making spaces safer for trans and non-binary people. It's important to honor a person's name regardless of what it says on their identity documents, because a lot of trans people can't necessarily afford to change their IDs right away. I've gone through it. It was a very expensive and time-consuming process. Someone might, if someone's under 18, they might even not legally be able to do it yet. There's all kinds of reasons that someone's official identity might differ from what they personally identify as, either in name or gender. And it can be very embarrassing if that name is spoken out loud, for example, at security. I mean, I remember going to a bar once after I had socially transitioned, but still had my old name on my driver's license, and the person read the name out loud in front of everybody. Horrible. You know, don't ever do that. Tell your security folks not to do that. And if you think about it, you know, some cis people don't, you know, use the names that are on their IDs either. I've known a lot of people that go by a middle name or a nickname that never use the official name on their license. So I think it's just a good practice in general. If you're having a women-specific event, like an editathon that you want to encourage women of all kinds to come to and show that you are aware of transgender women, it's best not to say women identified or use identified language, because that kind of stigmatizes transgender people as being people who identify as opposed to cisgender people who don't. From my perspective, everybody identifies. You either identify with the sex you were assigned at birth or you don't. So I feel that a better way to do this is saying trans and cis women welcome. That says explicitly that you acknowledge that trans and cis women are both women and you are understanding the language of transgender identity and you are welcoming everyone. So that's just, I'm not a woman, but I've talked with trans women and read trans women about this, and I would say the same for a men's event, but I really don't think there's a need for a men's only event personally, but I would say the same for that. Gender-neutral restroom facilities. This is huge. There are so many traumatic bathroom bills going around, popping up in different places in the country now. It's really distressing. I mean, ideally, you know, no one should be harassed for going into a restroom no matter what they look like, but we all know that that's not the case. Fortunately, in California, there is a new law that all single occupancy restrooms must be gender neutral, so that's a start. But it's not enough because sometimes there are only a men's and women's room and that's it. So consider if you're having an event, just labeling the rooms, you know, all genders welcome, or otherwise making it clear that people who are not a binary gender identity are welcome to use the restroom of their choice. And if you're booking an event with an overnight stay for a hotel, do recognize that not everybody is straight and not everybody is cisgender, so this would certainly affect roommate preferences in different ways than you might expect. Now, I am choosing to freely offer this information because I have the privilege to do so and I feel that it's important, but it really is exhausting being a trans person and being questioned all the time. So there are some questions that are really off limits, and if you think about it, these questions would not be appropriate to ask to anyone, whether they're transgender or cisgender. Questioning whether somebody is actually male or female, asking about somebody's sex life, asking about someone's genitals, asking someone if they've had the surgery, which is ridiculous because there's more than one surgery and you're not, you know, your transness is not dependent on whether you have had or ever will have surgery, so that's an especially offensive question. And as I feel that I've pointed out substantially, asking someone what their previous name was, which is a particular trigger to me. I mean, it might seem like a perfectly innocent question. You know, a number of cisgender people change their name and don't have a problem saying what their previous name was, but for transgender people, it can be seriously hurtful even to hear or read it, at least from my perspective. And just for the purposes of this Q&A, I also ask people not to ask any questions about my immediate family. So I've gone through a lot. I have a lot more on my blog. I have the link up there. I'm going to put this presentation up on Wikimedia Commons later today so people can access it, and people are welcome to email me or contact me through the English Wikipedia at the address there. And thank you very much for listening.
Hello.
Hello.
First of all, thank you very much for coming and for this incredible lecture. So I have a bit of a weird question, but I'm sure I'm not alone in it. So I'm a foreigner, and my original language is Hebrew. And much like a lot of other languages, I think French follows that, Spanish for the most part. My language is completely gendered. And not only that, it's binary gendered. Everything has a gender, including the chair and the table. It's impossible for me to say anything with a neutral gender. The neutral gender is considered male gender, which is not neutral. And we have a lot of issues with that also when we have, in Israel or something with events, because it's enough that you have a couple of men in the room, then the neutral form comes when it's male and all that kind of stuff. It's really, and there's a lot of movement now to try and balance it, but the balancing comes in a binary term. So you start, using all female pronouns or verbs and stuff like that instead of all male, like the neutral, stuff like that. But what I find that happens to me when I speak English is that it's really hard for me to use the term they, just because it slips out because I can't get myself to think neutral. It just automatically gets assigned to either. Even when you say a verb as they walked, it's either they male or they female in my language. So I'm fascinatedly looking at how my language is evolving, but it is a big problem. And I'm wondering, like, do you have any advice for that? Like, what happens when I slip up? What happens? Do I, because it happens and it's very, very embarrassing.
Yeah, if you, like I said, if you slip up, it's not a huge deal. I mean, in your case, you're coming from a language that is very binary. And I've heard, that complaint in a number of languages. I mean, I don't know a word of Hebrew, but I know some Spanish. I know that's a heavily gendered language, but there are non binary activists who are working to do things like replace O, which is a masculine ending, and A, a feminine ending, with E, for example, or replace it with an at sign in written language. I don't know if that's possible in Hebrew, but that's not your job, to rewrite the language. I think that, folks that use pronouns other than he or she recognize that there are people who legitimately have difficulty adopting gender neutral language for a variety of reasons. And that's part of actually why that I'm really hopeful that singular they becomes sort of the default. And I feel it almost has come to default rather than the somewhat more unusual pronouns that can take even more difficulty for people coming from different backgrounds to adopt to. And I think some people, back when I spent time on Tumblr, I mean, I don't go on Tumblr anymore because I'm like literally 3 times the average age of the Tumblr user, I swear. But, there are people using all kinds of, I don't want to say wacky pronouns because I don't want to be, ableist or anything, but pronouns that I don't think anyone outside of Tumblr would ever use. But I think they realize that, look, we have to accommodate people that really cannot wrap their head around it. So I don't feel that you should feel bad or apologetic about it, but just, try. If you screw up, like I said, apologize and move on. You don't have to beat yourself up over it. Just realize that if someone gets angry about it, it's probably not that they're angry at you. They're just angry at the collected microaggressions that they've been experiencing, and you're just the target of that. That's what I would say.
Hey, it's not a question. I'm just telling you that vandalism with they should kill themselves. I've hidden it now.
Sorry, I missed the last part of that. Vandalism. Oh, thank you very much. I was really trying to avoid canvassing, so I wasn't I I wasn't specific about where some of these edits were, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pax. I think 3 slides ago you used the example of how to be inclusive for events oriented. One, yep, where you say for women's events, be inclusive by saying trans and cis women welcome. That this has been a question I've had for a while. What if you want to invite people to an event and be actively inclusive for people who are agender or do not identify as a woman? How would you how I start to struggle with what that inclusive language looks like that isn't just non-cis male
Maybe
identified.
trans feminine is the word you're looking for. So people that are not women, but they are not men either. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're going for.
Or if someone is agender and doesn't identify
Like
as,
me.
right. I'm curious how I struggle. You said no men's events. Okay, that makes sense.
Just,
What about everyone but men? How do you, without
yeah,
saying everyone but men?
I have seen some of those events, basically everybody but cis men,
Mhm.
and I understand the thought behind it. I'm not a huge fan of it because I think of some of the assumptions that makes. So I don't know if I have a really good answer for that. I mean, because that's basically what you're going for. Everybody who is not a cis man is invited. So you could just say that and deal
Right.
with the pushback. But it's better to be explicit if that's what you're going for. Whoops. Sorry.
Thank you. I appreciate
No, I appreciate you wanting to include non-binary people. I mean, but I think if you're looking for a women's event, I mean, I've heard some of this. People want to have an event for trans and cis women, but also for people that are on the women's side of the spectrum, basically, even if they don't identify fully as women. So the word for that is trans feminine. So you could do that. I guess my trouble is I feel that there's the assumption that trans men and trans masculine people and agender people who are female assigned are somehow not going to be bros or whatever, not going to be, and that's I can tell you is not true. There are some trans men that are horribly sexist. There are some non-binary transgender people that are really problematic. So don't expect if you're just going to allow everybody but cis men that that's going to address those issues. That's all. That's what I would say.
It's a really fair point. Thank you very much.
Is anyone monitoring IRC? I don't know if there's any questions on there too, but okay. I'd be happy to answer digital questions too, because we got plenty of time. Anything else? Well, I'd be happy to talk with folks one-on-one if you're more comfortable with that, or talk offline or email if there are any more questions here. So,
We got a question on YouTube apparently.
just
So I don't
noticed
know.
the screen here.
Yeah, there's the IRC feed there. And it was that the subjects of Wikipedia articles often request article updates, like self-promotional job updates and personal information, like family details or hobbies. I'm not entirely sure what the question is there, but
Yeah, what's the question? I mean, that's not appropriate whether, oh, I see. Oh, without providing sources. Well, I would say that when it comes to gender identity, it doesn't have to be, well, to what extent are they different? I mean, with gender identity, if it's someone puts it on their social media, I think that's acceptable. It doesn't have to be published in, what we would normally require like a reliable source. It doesn't have to be published in a newspaper or TV show in order to honor their gender identity. If it's like a verified social media account, Twitter, Facebook, etc., then I think it's acceptable to update the gender identity based on that. I do think, let's see what the rest of this question is. Not made these updates until, yeah, third-party sources. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I don't have the exact policy on the tip of my brain, but I'm pretty sure that when it comes to gender identity, we do allow first-person sources for that, because really that's the only person who can know their gender identity for sure. So I don't think that's comparable to being self-promotional and talking about job updates and such. I would trust somebody's verified Twitter or Facebook account saying what their gender and pronouns are more than I would trust a third party, honestly.
I think a similar sort of related question that some people might have relating to something you mentioned earlier about how if a trans person only becomes only gains notoriety after they've started using a name different from their birth name, that their birth name shouldn't appear on the article at all. And I guess the question is like, how does that should that same rule apply to someone has like a stage name that they adopted and they didn't become famous until after they started using their stage name and they never used their birth name, or they a lot of people when they enter show business especially will change their name if they have a name that might be unusual or hard to pronounce. And is there a distinction to be drawn there between that and people changing their name for gender identity reasons?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a distinction. I mean, if someone, adopts a show business name but doesn't change their gender, I mean, I don't think they're going to be offended and physically, well, I shouldn't say physically harmed, but I mean, it's more mental. But I mean, I cannot tell you how bothersome it is for me to read, my previous name in conjunction with myself. I mean, I still get some mail, sent to my house with my old name on it, and just that can be triggering. I don't think that generally happens for someone who adopted a name for show business. Like, it's a very different thing. It's gender dysphoria is basically what it's called. It's a feeling of unease when your gender that you were assigned does not match the gender that you live as, and dead naming is a part of that. And I don't think that celebrities generally experience that. I mean, there may be a privacy issue if there's a little known celebrity that someone was able to only find their legal name by searching some obscure site, but then that wouldn't be allowed on Wikipedia anyway. It needs to be promoted or published better than that in order for it to meet the standards. So I think there's definitely a difference there. Cool answer. Oh, Lane, hey, thanks for that question.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Alex. I think that historically, or that when people talk about the gender gap on Wikipedia, most people assume it's talking about female participation and content about women. And, also there's lots of women's only events. We have an upcoming Wiki Women's Camp that is supposed to be more inclusive, but really there hasn't been that much communication around that to make people understand that it is open to trans women as well. So I'm wondering how to start to address this. Like, if you have ideas, I think that on our team and at the foundation, we're trying to be more gender inclusive and expansive in the way that we think about gender and communicate about the gender gap, but it's difficult when this is pretty ingrained in news and the culture and everything. And so I'm wondering if you have advice on how to try to start to expand that term and that idea of gender gap, et cetera.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like I said, a lot of these issues are simply out of ignorance. I mean, ignorance doesn't have to be a negative term. It's just people really not knowing. My presentation that I gave at Wiki Conference North America last October was specifically on the transgender gap. That was the title, but I emphasized that it's not the same goal as the male-female gender gap. I'm not trying to get the same number of transgender editors as cisgender editors, because there's only like maybe 0.5% of us in the country, so that would be ridiculous. I'm not trying to get an equal number of articles about transgender people as about cisgender people, so it's a slightly different issue. When it comes to including trans women, however, as I said in a previous slide, trans women are women. So I would just make it clear, that is respected and understood, and trans women are encouraged to submit and be featured in articles as much as cis women are. when it comes to non-binary people, we are a minority within a minority. So I think just having awareness, like as Catherine said, trying to have awareness about there are agender people and there are people who are neither male or woman, just that's a start. And if you just want to include it, just look at that language, look at the language you're using, and anytime that you are using a gendered word, think that is there a good reason for this? Is this really necessary? That's what I would ask. But again, these are steps. This isn't going to happen all at once. That's why I'm giving this talk today, just to try to educate people. Hey.
Hello. Most of the examples that you gave of policy debates surrounding gender issues were from English Wikipedia. I was wondering if you had any familiarity with similar or related debates that had happened on other language wikis or multi-language wikis like Commons.
I do not personally, but that's a great question, and I'd love input from people who have had that experience. I mean, I haven't participated in any kind of policy discussions on Commons at all, even though I've used it heavily. It's mostly just been for uploading photos that I took myself and adding categories. I have used Wikidata, and I have been concerned about some of the categorization of genders on there, for example. But I really haven't been involved in other Wikipedias as far as the policy discussion, but that's a great question. These discussions need to be happening everywhere. And I realize, different countries and different cultures will have different experiences with gender identity, and there can be some friction where it seems like we're dictating, an American standard or a Western standard on other people. That especially applies when it comes to what Westerners refer to as third gender, people from indigenous cultures who are outside of the gender binary, but I don't think any of them refer to themselves as either third gender or transgender, so that can be seriously problematic. But I don't personally have that experience, so I don't want to speak to it.
Another question, and this is something where there may be policies, and I don't, but I don't personally know what they are. One thing that's interesting, and I think this goes beyond gender identity, and it's also like has to do with sexual orientation and things, is terminology has changed a lot, and our understanding of these concepts have changed a lot, especially in the past 100 years or so. But obviously a lot of articles on Wikipedia are about historical figures, about whom we may know some things about their personal lives, but certainly like someone 400 years ago was unlikely to identify as bisexual, for example, right? Because that concept just didn't exist as much. So, but there are categories on Wikipedia, perhaps like famous bisexual people. What thoughts do you have, or policies do you know about for categorizing articles about people, like historical figures, and placing them in these categories using terminology that they might not have identity terminology that they might not have used themselves, in part because it wasn't available to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a complete answer for it, but it's important to recognize that terminology in the transgender community has shifted quite a bit in the last 50 years. As I mentioned, transsexual, for example, that term has really fallen out of favor, but it was used very heavily in the past, and some people, primarily older trans people, still identify with that term. Even the term genderqueer, like I mentioned, I really feel that non-binary would be more inclusive, but there's ongoing debate over whether to include that as a category or as an article title. And I feel that we should at least not categorize people incorrectly, but there isn't consensus necessarily for the change. So again, I don't have a complete answer to that because it's difficult when we don't have enough historical documents to confirm someone's gender identity or what terms they would have chosen for themselves. That's part of why, titled this Living Persons and focused on living trans people, but that doesn't mean that our ancestors aren't important as well. They very much are. So good question.
So another thing that I'm personally struggling with, and I see a lot of actually good changes around, but I'm curious about what else we can do about. So in the attempt to respect people's pronouns, A lot of times it's a little, so if we have like, meetings and something like that, that we know in advance that that's what we want to do, we start out with, maybe when you introduce yourselves, also say what your preferred pronoun is. And that's great. But when you have, events either that are not catering to that specific thing, that this is not happening, or when you have like just general meetings with people, do you bring this up? Like, how do you respect someone's pronouns without, because if you bring it up, I feel like maybe you're antagonizing someone. On the other hand, if you don't bring it up, you might get it wrong, and that not. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, there are a couple different fields of thought on this. One is that we should just ask everyone their pronouns and normalize it. Because if you only ask people that you're not sure of, that can be stigmatizing, because then the person thinks, oh, my gender is not obvious. This can especially be hurtful to trans women if they're dressed in a very feminine way and you ask, what pronouns, then they think they're not, they don't look like a woman, and that could really be harmful. So I don't think we're at a place, at least in U.S. society yet, where we can just straight up ask everybody's pronouns. But if you have an event, then use a name tag. Have a place on the name tag to explicitly put what the pronouns are. I've been ordering these stickers that have a place that say, my name is, and then please use, and then they have pre-filled pronouns, he, she, they, them, a couple others, and then a fill in the blank page. And the funny thing is, the first time that I brought these to an event, I saw people that I knew weren't transgender and were binary gendered wearing the ones that said they, because they were a different color and they didn't notice that they had the pronouns on them. They just thought, oh, I want a green one, I want a red one, because they just take it, and that's okay. I mean, I wasn't offended by it. I was just like, hey, when did you start using they pronouns? And they're like, oh, wait, So it's not in the culture yet, and some people just say, well, let's make that be the culture. And I think that's very appropriate in social justice spaces and progressive spaces, but it's just not there yet for everyone. So I would just say, again, if you got an event where everyone's wearing a name tag anyway, put that space in there, and lead by example. Cisgender people should put their pronouns on there right away, so it's known that it's not just for trans and non-binary folks. Any other questions? Any more on YouTube or IRC? Going once, going twice. Okay, thanks everyone. And again, I'll hang around as long as you want to talk, and thanks very much for listening.